You know, when you think about historical Japan, there's one image that probably pops into your head. A country completely locked away from the rest of the world for more than 200 years. It's a great story of samurai and shoguns deliberately closing the gates. But what if that popular story isn't the whole story? Let's dive in and find out what really happened.
So, let's start with the big question. Was Japan ever really a locked country? In this explainer, we're going to peel back the layers on this famous period of Japanese history and see the difference between the myth we all know and the surprising economic reality.
Okay, first things first, let's get a key term down. The policy was called sakoku. Now in Japanese, that literally translates to locked country. It was put in place by the government at the time, the Tokugawa shogunate, and their main goal was to strictly control foreign influence and trade. And controlling is really the key word here, not completely stopping.
All right, so let's start with that story we all think we know, the popular idea of a totally isolated Japan.
The version most of us hear is that, starting in the 1630s, Japan just slammed its doors shut. Nobody in, nobody out. No trade, no contact, just total isolation. It's a simple, really powerful image, right? But it's also a little too simple.
The reality was, well, a lot more complicated. Those first rules back in the 1630s, they weren't actually about stopping trade. They were specifically aimed at kicking out Christian missionaries from Spain and Portugal because the government was worried they were stirring up trouble. But the economic impact of that move? Pretty much zero. In fact, trade didn't stop at all. Far from it. Japan kept doing business with a few select partners: the Dutch, the Chinese, and the Koreans. Now, don't get me wrong, it was heavily controlled and limited to specific port cities like Nagasaki. But the government was so practical about it, they even checked with the Dutch beforehand to make sure they could handle all the extra business.
So if the 1630s weren't the real shutdown, then when did things actually change? This is where we get to the real economic story. Check out this timeline, because it shows two totally different moments. The 1630s, that was all about politics and religion. But if you fast forward about 50 years to 1685, that is when the real economic lockdown started. The government put strict limits, or caps, on the total value of stuff that could be imported. Actually, some historians argued that this was the real start of sakoku. So, why the big change all of a sudden? Well, it wasn't about foreigners or religion anymore. It was a money problem, plain and simple. See, back then, Japan was paying for all its imported luxury goods, things like fancy silk and sugar, with silver from its mines.
And by 1685, there was a huge problem. Japan's silver mines, they were running out. They were literally running out of the cash they needed to pay for everything they were buying from other countries.
And this really gets to the heart of it. The government, which was called the Bakufu, put these trade caps in place simply because its silver mines were running dry. It wasn't some grand philosophy of isolation, it was a practical money decision. See, the key thing to get here is that Japan didn't really choose to shut down trade, it was kind of forced to, because its national bank account was getting dangerously low.
But this is where the story takes a really incredible turn. This economic crisis, it actually kicked off a huge wave of Japanese innovation. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you can't buy something, you figure out how to make it yourself.
Let's just take the story of silk, which was Japan's #1 import. When those trade limits hit in 1685, the supply of foreign silk just dried up, and merchants started to panic. But what happened next was amazing. Japan responded by pouring resources into building its own domestic silk industry. You know, the whole process of raising silkworms, which is called sericulture.
And the result? Oh, it was just unbelievably successful. By the early 1800s, Japan was making more than twice the amount of silk it used to import, even back when foreign trade was at its highest. It totally flipped the script, going from a major importer to a world-class producer.
And get this, it wasn't just a one-off thing with silk. The exact same thing happened with sugar, which was Japan's second biggest import. The trade restrictions forced Japan to get creative and figure out how to grow and process its own sugar. This was really the birth of a powerful made-in-Japan economy.
So, Japan built this strong internal economy, which is great. But being a nation of islands, well, that also came with some pretty unique challenges. And one of the most terrifying was the problem of famines.
You know the famous economist Adam Smith? He had a theory. He basically said that in a big country where you can move goods around freely, a food shortage in one place shouldn't cause a massive famine, because you can just ship food in from another area that has extra.
And this is the puzzle. By the 18th century, Japan had a really well-connected internal market. Rice was being shipped all over the country. So, based on Adam Smith's theory, big famines just shouldn't have happened. But they did. So why?
Well, the answer wasn't a bad economy. It was something way bigger. The overwhelming power of nature. Huge volcanic eruptions, some as far away as Iceland, caused the entire planet to cool down. This led to cold summers and terrible rice harvests all across Japan. And when this happened for several years in a row, the whole system just broke down. See, most people had just enough food to get by, so there wasn't a lot of extra saved up. One bad harvest was tough. 2 or 3 in a row was a catastrophe that even a connected market couldn't fix.
So when we put all these pieces of the puzzle together, what are we left with? What is the true legacy of this period of so-called isolation?
It's really a mixed bag. On the one hand, that economic pressure sparked that powerful made-in-Japan innovation and built a strong, unified internal market. This actually gave Japan an incredible foundation to modernize super quickly later on. But on the other hand, the policy blocked a lot of new scientific knowledge from the West. And being cut off from global food supplies left the population dangerously vulnerable when those massive natural disasters hit.
And this leaves us with a final, really big question that's still so relevant today. The story of Sakoku Japan really makes you think. Is it better for a country to be self-sufficient, to develop its own industries from the inside out, or is it better to be deeply connected to the global world, with all the opportunities and all the risks that come with it? Japan's history shows us there's no easy answer.